Now, today it's all about the solar era and the separation from nature, and it's also about the emergence of the ego, that is the conscious mind, and the separation of the conscious mind from the deeper matrix of the primordial soul, which had been going on for 25,000 years before this happened, at least, sort of thing. So we have to remember this is all about individuality, the emergence of the individual from the collective of the tribe, which has not yet happened in the Muslim society. We can see what a collective society looks like today, which is what it looked like prior to this era, during the solar era, before the individual began to emerge. So, around 2500 BC, we enter a totally different era, an era which sees the emergence of the ego from the matrix of instinct and the primordial soul. This whole era is about the gradual emergence of the individual from the collective life of the tribe and the development of the conscious mind. But it is also about a violent and traumatic separation from nature. So in this second talk, I'm going to look at the last 4,000 years, that is from roughly 2500 BC, that I've named the solar era. During this era, the sun replaced the moon as the primary celestial image, and the Great Father replaced the Great Mother as the image of deity. Western civilization developed on the foundation of a fundamental dissociation between spirit and nature, creator and creation. This is terribly important, and between the masculine and feminine archetypes that were associated with these. This dissociation, or split, effectively destroyed the ancient shamanic understanding of the presence of spirit in the phenomenal world and opened the way to its ultimate exploitation. Instead of there being a marriage between them, the masculine archetype assumed a position of dominance in relation to the feminine one. Nature, soul, woman, matter, and body, as the 5 aspects of the feminine archetype, were downgraded in relation to spirit, man, and mind. This is nobody's fault, this is what happened. The evolution of the Western mind, this is written by a friend of mine in a wonderful book called The Passion of the Western Mind. The evolution of the Western mind has been driven by a heroic impulse to forge an autonomous, rational human self by separating it from the primordial unity with nature. But to do this, the masculine mind had to repress the feminine. The evolution of the Western mind has been founded on the repression of the feminine, the repression of whatever the masculine mind defined as other. And other was what was threatening to the masculine mind and had to be eradicated. So, this is the 2 phases of consciousness. I talked about the first yesterday. Today we see the second phase coming into being. As the conscious ego emerged from the deeper matrix of the psyche, they began to grow apart, and as a result we came to look upon cosmos, deity, and the world of nature as something separate and different from ourselves, and that's the situation we're still in now. Something that we could observe and explore but no longer feel part of. Mind and soul grew further and further apart. That is, the masculine and the feminine grew further and further apart, because the feminine was the deep matrix of the mother, the maternal source or ground of the psyche. And this has led, after some 4,000 years, to the current scientific belief that we live in a dead universe without purpose or meaning, that consciousness is the creation of the physical brain, and that God and the soul are beliefs left over from our superstitious and thankfully outgrown past. So that again is the situation we face today. So I've drawn this diagram of the psyche to show you how the emerging ego and the conscious mind, you'll see that below the red line is the matrix of instinct and the primordial soul, and what Jung called the collective unconscious, and also nature, and beyond that the cosmos. And that little yellow triangle at the top is the solar ego, which is still very fragile. It's not secure at all. So that yellow triangle stands for the emerging ego and the self-awareness, terribly important, this new self-awareness of the conscious mind. That was a tremendous evolutionary achievement to actually get that ability to reflect before acting instinctively. So memories that are held in our older brain system, that is the reptilian and the mammalian brain, which is in the lower part of that diagram, still interact with and influence our neocortical mind, which is the most recently developed part of our brain and nervous system. Our problems today arise from the fact that over the last 4 millennia, our ego and our conscious mind, that tiny aspect of our total psyche, has become detached from the deeper matrix of the primordial soul out of which it evolved, like the child emerging from the mother. As time went on, the conscious mind has become more and more inflated and omnipotent. Its detachment is now complete, and it no longer has any awareness of or relationship with the psychic depths from which it has emerged, no relationship with nature or the cosmos. Like Icarus in the Greek myth, it has flown too close to the sun, and it's in great danger of plunging into the sea and being destroyed because of that. But one has to remember that the emergence of the ego and the conscious mind is the greatest evolutionary achievement of the whole solar era. But this achievement gradually opened a chasm between spirit, that was associated with mind, and nature, that came to be associated with the body and with matter. Huge separation there. This whole process was closely tied into the invention of writing and the power that literacy gave to a tiny elite group of educated and very powerful males. Gradually, the mind assumed a position of dominance over the body, and man assumed a position of dominance over nature and woman. This 4,000-year-long process was, I think, largely unconscious, and as I say, nobody can be blamed for it. It just happened. We have still not emerged anything like from its influence. So now I'm going to go a bit into the historical background. The solar era is a time of tumultuous social and political upheaval. New tribes worshipping sky gods invaded the thriving river valleys that had for millennia worshipped the Great Mother, and later the many goddesses and gods of the Bronze Age, as in Sumer and Egypt, and in India to this day. These warrior tribes had a terrifying impact on the settled communities they invaded and destroyed. They might be compared to the warriors of Islamic State today, whose psyche has regressed to the behavior pattern of that far distant past. Vast numbers of former agriculturally based people began to move to walled towns, and these grew rapidly, very rapidly, as increase of population, into large cities with walls around them. A largely egalitarian society was replaced by a new hierarchical patriarchal order. With the rise of literacy in the priestly class, powerful bureaucracies emerged to govern these cities and later empires. Colossal temples were built like the ziggurat in Mesopotamia. Kings appeared whose ambition was to create and rule vast empires. So we have the Persian Empire first of all, then the Babylonian, the Assyrian, and later the Greek and Roman, and then ultimately the Holy Roman Empire of Europe. Discoveries in astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and an incredible creative outpouring into temples and palaces and sculptures and exquisite works of art of all kinds was promoted by the immense wealth of the rulers of these empires. But they were built on the sacrifice of the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men who had to face the terror of death by the sword, as described in the Iliad. There's a book called Why Homer Matters, published by a man called Adam Nicholson, which describes what these tribes were like and how they acted and how terrifying they were and how they were unstoppable. If you want to read what a real description of that period, I would get it, Why Homer Matters. So now we move into the mythology that was the background here. There are 4 powerful mythologies that dominate the solar era. This is a historical and social background, I should say, to the change in mythology and the relationship between the masculine and feminine archetypes that was to have such a profound influence on the development of Western civilization in particular. Obviously, I can't cover what happened in China or in India, but you also have the Mahabharata in India, which is the same mythology as I'm going to describe now. So there are four powerful mythologies that dominate this era. First of all, the myth of the battle between light and darkness, good and evil. Secondly, the hero myth. Thirdly, the myth of Prometheus stealing the fire from heaven. And finally, the myth of the fall of man. I haven't included the Christian myth here because it's really outside the course really that I'm giving here, but obviously it's important for the whole era. The primary theme of solar mythology is the battle between good and evil, light and darkness, the ascent to the light and the conquest or overcoming of darkness. It originated in Persia with the great sage Zoroaster and is reflected in this image of the solar hero killing a dragon. It is this myth that polarizes and divides. It is this myth that drives the battle to conquer and subdue nature in the service of man, and the ideology of limitless growth and progress, leaving behind everything that is the past, overcoming the past, looking always to the future and to progress. Despite its huge cultural achievements, this 4,000-year-long era has been dominated by conquest, territorial expansion, and the creation of these gigantic empires, culminating in the polarized situation we face today in the Middle East, with thousands of desperate people fleeing death and destruction of their homes and livelihoods. But this is something that happened 4,000 years ago and has happened right the way through. Always this destruction of homes, livelihoods, crops, destroyed by the foraging armies. But this myth also describes humanity's immense evolutionary task. It really drives humanity's task of bringing human consciousness from a state of virtual unconsciousness or darkness to the fullest development or state of enlightenment of which it is capable. Through eons of Earth time, we can now trace the story of the evolution of life on this planet, our own separation and emergence from the matrix of nature, and our arduous quest for greater understanding of life and ourselves through search, suffering, and heroic endeavor. This doesn't mean to say that in the goddess cultures there was total unconsciousness, but there was a different kind of consciousness, much more instinctive, much more, just in touch with everything and acting on that feeling of being in touch, but not thinking specifically of should I wait before I kill that man or whatever, you know. There was no hesitation between the instinct and the carrying out of whatever the program was. Whereas with the beginning of the self-reflective consciousness, you begin to get, through religion mainly, the teaching that we have to wait sometimes before acting. So we need to understand this mythology in the context of the psyche. And in this context, it can be understood to reflect the ego's struggle for autonomy in relation to the immense power of the matrix of nature. It's a huge power, and I'm coming to it later, symbolized by the dragon. But you can see with a child how difficult it is to get that sense of individuality and how to find its way in the world, and it has to act initially by instinct, and then it goes to school and it has to learn you can't do this and you can't do that, you have to do this, you have to do that. So it's programmed differently once it begins to have self-reflective consciousness. And if you put that back into the growth of humanity and the evolution of humanity, that is what was happening during this new era. Many new things had to be learnt. You had to obey the priests, for one thing. So the emerging ego's greatest fear was being swallowed by the jaws of the dragon, falling back into unconsciousness and dissolution. It felt it had to ascend to the sun, away from nature, away from darkness, away from the Great Mother and the jaws of the dragon, which would swallow it up again. Snap. And this is the great fear of psychosis, of course, because that's being swallowed again by the unconscious. This was tantamount to matricide, because the ego's struggle for autonomy ultimately destroyed the possibility of maintaining a relationship with the deep ground of the psyche. I think things could have been different if there had been a marriage between the Great Father and the Great Mother. That is the huge cultural mistake that was missed, as it were. The inner dissociation in the psyche, the inner situation, was soon projected onto the battle against external enemies in the world. And that's the way it's gone on right into the time of George W. Bush and Tony Blair. The enemy is out there, we've got to defeat it out there. Whereas the focus of lunar culture was on the alignment of the human community with the rhythm of the Earth's cycles and the vast living body of the cosmos, the focus of solar culture was on the desire to conquer, whether nature, territory, or tribal enemies. Now, one of the most important features of this era is a separation of the individual from the tribal group through his outstanding achievements. That was the way he separated himself. And of course, he dons the mantle of the solar hero, and above all, the mantle of the warrior. That's the only way he could escape from the collective, was to gain fame in battle and the number of enemies that he killed. His deeds were celebrated in the courts of kings and in the marketplace. There are two famous books that set the scene for the emergence of the individual, and they are the Iliad and the Odyssey. Achilles and Odysseus are prototypes of the solar hero, whose prowess in battle is legendary. However, as illustrated in the great play by Euripides called The Trojan Women, the fate of the women whose men had lost the battle was to be sold into slavery, like the Yazidi women today. Their male children murdered as Andromache's young son was flung from the walls of Troy. We can see this archaic pattern being acted out in Syria and Iraq today in the treatment and enslavement and rape of the Yazidi women by the warriors of Islamic State. So this is just a repetition of the old pattern that's been going on for 4,000 years. All these myths and stories gave young men a model to copy, and of course every young man of 18 to 20 would want to be a warrior. That's what he was brought up to be. All suggest that men had to face and overcome the power of instinct to paralyze with terror, as in the famous story of Theseus and the Minotaur, or Perseus and the Gorgon, going back to our childhood myths that we loved so much. So, this is the very important background. It had a huge influence. These particular mythologies were told in every marketplace in the Mediterranean for centuries. The hero myth of the warrior begins with Achilles. When Achilles met an enemy on the battlefield, it was said that he rushed against him like a lion, a ravening lion that men are fain to slay. Astonishingly, the poetry of the Iliad is echoed in the words of the jihadists in Syria, who are using the same kind of epic poetry to describe their deeds. The battlefield has never witnessed an act such as theirs. The warrior, like a wounded lion, plunged into the battle. That's a recent quote. So this ancient pattern of behavior is repeated over and over again. And here we have Achilles killing Hector, who was the son of King Priam of Troy. And it was Hector's wife, Andromache, who was taken into slavery, and their son who was flung from the walls of Troy. Now we come to Alexander the Great, who again is the prototype of a later prototype of the hero. Until his early death, Alexander the Great was absolutely driven by the desire for conquest. Conquest that led him through Persia as far as Afghanistan, where there are still children that are named after him. History doesn't tell us what Aristotle, his tutor, thought of his astonishing life path, but we know that he slept with a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle by his bedside. Isn't that fascinating? It is as if the heroic human ego that he personifies, identified with the solar hero, has to seek out new territories to conquer, has to embody the myth in a literal sense and channel the primitive territorial drives of the psyche into a Dionysian orgy of unbridled conquest, slaughter, and destruction. The great city of Persepolis was destroyed by Alexander the Great, razed to the ground by fire because a courtesan said, "Wouldn't it be fun to set it on fire?" And that was the end of Persepolis. And it's just about Palmyra is threatened today, which is one of the most beautiful places that still exist from Roman times, in the same way. So we hear very little about the suffering generated by these conquests, the weeping widows, the mothers who lost sons, the raped women, the orphaned children, and the crops and patterns of sowing and harvesting devastated by the foraging armies passing over them, the sacked cities and exquisite works of art pillaged and looted. The long chronicle of conquest and human sacrifice which continues today, the drive for power and the subjugation of enemies, might truly be named the dark shadow of the solar age, and we are still locked into this mythology. The unconscious addiction to war has led us to this, the sacrifice of the lives of nearly 900,000 young men. All of whom were heroes. Wherever we hear the words power, conquest, and victory, we can be sure that we are in the presence of solar mythology. More young men and women will die, and we will mourn them just as we mourn those already lost, but we will continue as before, unless we wake up to our shadow. The archetype of the solar hero as warrior still exerts immense unconscious influence on the modern male psyche in the battlefield of politics and corporations, as well as that, I've said this, as well as that of corporate business, and even the constant focus on war and male violence in films and television. The primary aim of the male is presented as the need to achieve, to win, and if necessary defeat other males, and the primary task of the warrior now, as then, is to find the courage to face the terror of death. But can you imagine how many sensitive young men had to be indoctrinated with this belief that they could only be warriors unless you were crippled or unless you wanted to be a monk or something? You couldn't get out of it. It was your fate. Now we come to Prometheus. Now Prometheus stole the fire of heaven from the gods and gave it to humanity, and for that he was punished by Zeus to be chained to a rock in the Caucasus and have his liver pecked out every day by an eagle. But he was rescued eventually by Atlas, who said, "Come on, old boy, I can get you out of this fix." And he undid the chains, and all was well for Prometheus. There has been a Promethean energy driving Western civilization. This energy has been directed at the long struggle to overcome whatever has impeded the progress of humanity. It's tied into the other myth of the battle between good and evil, light and dark. There's been the great quest for freedom and enlightenment, the struggle against tyranny, against slavery, against the oppression of women and the sexual abuse of children today. It drives the struggle to bring education to the still illiterate masses of the world, to lift people out of poverty and misery, to improve their physical and mental health by medical advance, and to help in an infinite number of ways, because it's a human instinct is to help, want to improve things, even things like potholes in the roads. We want to fill them in and make it better, so to speak. So that's deep in the human psyche. It's led to the sublime creations of the men who designed and built the great Gothic cathedrals, for example, and also to all those wonderful works of art by poets or artists and great musicians. It has led to the tremendous scientific discoveries of men like Copernicus and Galileo, of Newton and Einstein, but it has also led to the lethal power of our weapons of mass destruction that now threaten us with annihilation. In creating these weapons, man has indeed stolen the fire of gods from heaven. Now, one of the most important myths of the solar era is the myth of the fall of man, and I'm going to spend some time of it because it's so important and it's absolutely at the root of Western civilization. So this is the fourth immensely powerful myth that's dominated this whole era. It's perhaps the most dramatic and influential myth of the solar phase of separation. The myth originates, as you know, in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. For over 2 millennia, it has been interpreted as literal fact and as divine revelation, and it became the foundation of Christian doctrine and the reason why we needed a Redeemer. This is very important. It's right at the root of Christianity. In this myth, the worship of the Great Father replaces that of the Great Mother. Divine immanence is lost, that is to say, nature is no longer divine. The emphasis is on the transcendence and remoteness of God or Spirit. Earth becomes a place of exile and punishment for primordial sin. Man is given dominion over the earth, but he is no longer part of the divine order. He lives in a world that is contaminated by the fall and subject to sin, suffering, and death. If we look at the myth of the fall from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, the whole myth can be read as a metaphor that describes the birth of self-awareness and our separation from the matrix of nature, the Garden of Eden out of which we have evolved. By the way, this is by Cranach. It's a very, very beautiful painting. It shows the whole story, the whole cycle. But the radical change of consciousness which it reflects tore us out of nature and led to pathological symptoms of anxiety and the compensatory desire for power and security, resulting from a profound experience of dissociation, separation, and loss. Of course, this was all unconscious. Symptoms similar to those a child exhibits when it's lost its mother. Comes up as rage later on, the grief of the child that had to be held and carried without being able to express it. Comes up as rage. We lost the feeling of connection between ourselves and an invisible ground of spirit that was active and present within the visible world. And we lost the sense of kinship with all creation. Two very important losses. Unfortunately, even tragically, the myth was taken literally as divine revelation, which it would have to be then because there wasn't the psychological insight that we have now. So it was taken as given by God. And the Christian psyche was imprinted with the belief that human nature was fallen, marred in sin, punished by God and condemned to exile and suffering on earth. Christians have been taught and have believed for 2,000 years that their only chance of redemption was the doctrines and rituals of the Church and the saving grace of the sacrificial death of the Son of God. There was no salvation for those who were not Christians. In this myth, the image of deity changes from Great Mother to Great Father. Now, this has been found out, these facts that I'm giving you, by a very clever priestly inversion by a priest of the First Temple. The goddess Asherah, who was at that time worshipped as the Great Mother in what is now Palestine, was demoted quite deliberately into the human and flawed figure of Eve, who still strangely carries the title once held by the goddess, Mother of all living. In Genesis 3, God says to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth thy children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." And God says to Adam, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life." For nearly 2,000 years, countless millions have assimilated the message of this cruel, rejecting, and punishing God, and felt themselves burdened with original sin. Nowhere in the myth of the fall do we find the celebration of the sacred nature of sexual love, nor the recognition of this world as a sacred order of reality. It was only the Garden of Eden that was sacred. On the contrary, expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the suffering of both man and woman were presented as a divinely imposed punishment for the role of our primal ancestors in initiating the fall. The idea of God as a deity willing to sacrifice his only son for the redemption of humanity entered theological history. Henceforth, worship was directed away from earth towards the transcendent Father in heaven. All rituals of relationship with nature, all the ancient practices of speaking to spirits and listening to what they were saying, all the rituals of relationship with nature and the Great Mother or Great Goddess were ruthlessly suppressed, often under pain of death. There is no more striking image of this sense of exile and loss than our expulsion from the Garden of Eden, with an angel with a flaming sword barring our re-entry. I think this myth has had a disastrous effect on the human psyche and on Western civilization, that is, Christian civilization as a whole. It led to deep feelings of sexual guilt and to a virulent misogyny, because all women were identified with Eve as the ultimate cause of the fall. This myth is, in my view, the origin of the misogyny which spread like a contagious virus through the three patriarchal religions, because all three were infected by it. A misogyny that reached its most obscene expression in the witch trials of the 15th to the 18th centuries, when over 100,000 women were burnt at the stake. What were the effects of the tremendous archetypal shift of emphasis from lunar to solar mythology, and from creator as mother to creator as father? And why did it happen? I think it happened because at this stage in the evolution of consciousness, the fragile ego needed the support of the masculine archetype to help it emerge from the feminine matrix of instinct, to strengthen and focus it, to develop what we call our rational mind. This is why it's so important for the father to be present in the bringing up of a child as well as the mother. It's absolutely vital that the father is there to help the child manifest itself in the world. It's very difficult for the mother alone to do this. So it formulated a male image of deity. However, the elimination of the image of the Great Mother has had profound effects on the balance of the Western psyche, as well as on Western civilization, because within the psyche it led to a radical dissociation between the still fragile ego and the deeper matrix of consciousness out of which it was emerging. Fear, guilt, and shame have been the underlying emotions of this whole era, 2,000 years of fear, shame, and guilt. Fear of God, fear of divine punishment, fear of doing wrong, guilt and punishment for any sexual aberration, such as homosexuality, shame in case anything hidden should be revealed to the community, the belief that the body must be controlled, mortified, made to suffer for its desires, and in general brought into a relationship of subjection to the mind, is very deeply ingrained in the Christian psyche. There's even one sect, I think they're called the Opus Dei, who actually hurt their bodies with instruments of torture in order to bring them closer to humility and therefore to God. It's an obscene doctrine, that. I really cannot stand it because of the injury to the body and because it doesn't get you any closer to God. I'm being extremely strong here, but this passion that I've held for many years hidden, when I studied all these texts of the early Christian fathers, it is coming out in this talk. So here we have it. Eve, by her disobedience, brought death on herself and all the human race. And Mary, by her obedience, brought salvation. So what a program for the woman's psyche. Only by being obedient will you be saved. There are some 2 billion Christians in the world today, nearly a third of the world's population, who will absorb the idea that a woman was responsible for bringing death, sin, and suffering into the world, and that because of her primordial sin, humanity carries the bitter legacy of the fall. These 2 beliefs, so entwined with each other, have deeply wounded the Christian soul. They have wounded woman's image of herself, as well as man's image of woman, and also the image of the feminine aspect of his own nature, which he would naturally look down upon and be very frightened of connecting with. because it was associated with all this business. These old beliefs still manifest in our secular culture in the debasement and abuse of women displayed in pornography and Twitter trolls, as well in the ongoing deplorable domestic science. That was a Freudian slip and a half, wasn't it? The ongoing deplorable domestic violence towards women. Apologies to all women present. Even the obsession with sex that's so much a part of modern Western culture, you can't open a newspaper without seeing something to do with sex. It's part of the same sexual complex that led to its repression. It's the other side, as it were, but it doesn't mean to say the complex has gone away underneath, no matter how much you're telling people to sleep with anybody and have a great time, etc., etc. So I think the greatest sickness in Christian culture has been, 1, the belief that the body was the repository of sin, 2, the repression of the instinctive delight in life, including the celebration of sexuality, and 3, the oppression and enforced subservience of women. Women couldn't do anything else than be subservient if they were to survive. They had to serve the whole community in order to win any kind of position in society. They had to look after the old and the young, they had to feed the sick and everything. They took on the whole burden of serving the community. So the primary mistake in Christian teaching was to split nature from spirit and body from soul. The soul and the instinctive feeling values associated with it were consistently overridden and ignored, and the voice of woman was silenced. The second mistake was the belief that in order to cultivate the soul, we had to deny, repudiate, and even inflict suffering on the body. Suffering or denial inflicted on the body was believed to open the path to God, and this came straight through from the early Christian fathers. Only by repudiating her sexuality and renouncing the world could a woman become acceptable to God. So the question I would put to you is this: did this myth bring us to a higher and more evolved state of consciousness, or has it held us back for 2,000 years? Now I'm coming to the effects of these two polarizing mythologies, or all 4 polarizing mythologies. The feminine archetype associated with nature, soul, body, and matter was split off from spirit. Thinking gradually became dissociated from feeling, and thinking became all important, whereas feeling was sort of pushed down. Nature and the earth were no longer sacred, and nature was effectively desouled by this whole process. Man became identified with spirit and with mind, and woman became identified with nature and body. Woman was womb, and woman's whole task in life was to bear life, and preferably a son, for man. That was her only role until very recently. So woman became subject to man, giving rise to the misogyny that still afflicts us today all over the world. By the way, the people who raped the woman in Delhi, other people said that's Eve teasing, it's nothing important, it's just Eve teasing. So even in India they know about this myth. Body was split off from mind and mind from soul, and from 418 AD, church doctrine taught that sexual intercourse transmitted the original sin of the fall. This was the worst thing of all, and this was due to St. Augustine. According to St. Augustine's teaching, original sin was transmitted like an incurable disease through the sexual act. Adam's sin had corrupted the whole of nature and made it subject to death. So death only came in due to Adam and Eve's sin. But the entire sorry story was initiated by Eve. She was at the root of the whole business. And this wretched belief is what was incorporated into church doctrine. And can you imagine, every time anybody slept with wife or husband, they were transmitting that sin. Every time they had a child, the child carried the sin. And that's why the Catholic Church baptized the child before saving the life of the mother, because it was more important to save the child from original sin than it was to save the life of the mother. Western civilization developed on the foundation of this fundamental split between spirit and nature and between mind and body. And today we're faced with the devastating effects of the absence of the feminine in our concept of spirit. There is no relationship with the life of the planet, no apparent awareness that we are destroying the habitat that sustains us, a habitat that was once held to be sacred, as it still is in shamanic cultures. So our most urgent task today is to heal the split between spirit and nature within ourselves as well as within the culture, and to reconnect our conscious rational mind with the feminine matrix of our psyche that Jung called our primordial soul. Secondly, it is to free world culture from the ongoing male addiction to power and conquest. If you think that's a heroic task, it is. But it has to be done in a feminine way, as Stella was saying. It has to be done. We have to find the ways of doing it that do not offend or make man defensive and angry that he's being attacked. In this early 20th century of the painting of the Cyclops, a one-eyed giant gazes out over a beautiful landscape holding the figure of a naked woman. No image illustrates more eloquently the current dissociation of our rational conscious mind and its one-eyed vision from the deeper matrix of our soul and its different way of knowing. World culture is now enthralled to this one-eyed consciousness. Immersed in the fascination with technology and the brilliance of the human mind, we have forgotten our profound relationship with and dependence on the planet. Technological progress, scientific advance, the acquisition of wealth and political and corporate power have become the supreme goals. Terrifying weapons are placed on high alert, ready to be faced at an enemy. The rational mind has virtually replaced God. It is now the supreme value, the solar hero. Cut off from its roots, it no longer recognizes a dimension of reality beyond the physical universe, nor any form of consciousness transcendent to its own. It has lost all awareness of the soul. I just want briefly to look at science in the last 4 centuries, because it's very important to understand. When science broke away from religion in the 16th century, this is Newton, of course, it developed on the foundation of the long-established association between spirit and nature that had existed for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. Christian theology had banished the idea of spirit being present in nature and matter by eradicating all vestiges of animism, of spirit being present in nature. So as science broke away from the control of the Church after Galileo in the 16th century, it focused its attention on this world, on nature and on matter, everything that had been neglected by Christianity, and on the whole process of evolution in the universe and the process of evolution on Earth. So this became the focus, the fascination of science, which is wonderful, absolutely wonderful that it happened like that. But it had assimilated the idea that spirit was not present in nature or matter, that matter was dead, inert, and without life or intelligence, and therefore science could do anything it wanted with matter. Didn't matter. Matter didn't feel anything, didn't experience any pain. Thenceforth, with its growing emphasis on the rational mind, it was natural for the philosophy of scientific materialism, or scientific reductionism as it's called, to get rid of both God and the soul, since their existence could not be proven through their methodologies that it had developed. It did not embrace the idea of the further development of human consciousness and the higher states of mind that have been long known to the metaphysical traditions of the East. There's no idea in Christianity of developing consciousness further. There's emphasis on being good, kind, forgiving your enemies, but not on actually transforming our consciousness. Whereas the Eastern traditions have long, for 4,000 years or 6,000, have had that tradition. So the vacuum left by the decline of Christianity in the West was soon filled by the ideologies that tore the 20th century apart. So now I'm going to go deeper into those ideologies. Jung warned us about our unconsciousness with these words: "As at the beginning of the Christian era, so again today we are faced with the problem of the general moral backwardness of our species, which has failed to keep pace with our scientific, technical, and social progress." Now I'm coming to the dragon. Because the dragon, like the dinosaur, personifies the immense power of unconscious primordial instincts in relation to the rational mind, to the conscious mind, represented here by the solar hero who's doing his best to kill it. But he's not going to get very far with something so enormous and so powerful. These instincts have unconsciously controlled our habits of behavior for countless millennia and now threaten our species with extinction. This is a terribly important part of this talk. Religions have had very little impact on their dark aspect. But it's important to know that this deeper matrix of the psyche is also the source of our extraordinary imagination and our creative powers. Like nature herself, because we're part of nature, we carry within us both creative and destructive powers, powers that come to us ultimately from the stupendous energy of the cosmos. But we have to know that we carry both within us. We can't be all good. We're also carrying this potential for very destructive behavior. Now I've brought here some lion pictures, because the lion is not only an image of the predator aspect of the psyche, as above left, that can take us over, but also an image of the courage, strength, and instinctive intelligence that we carry within the depths of our limbic brain. We all carry this. I must tell you a lovely story about my publisher, because he was in a very difficult situation, and one night he had a dream that a lion was clawing at his door, a huge male lion, and he opened the door with, being a therapist himself, he knew what to do. He opened the door, let the lion in, and the lion said, "I thought you'd never open it," and lay down on the hearth. And since that time, his life has been transformed. He's now got a partner he's fallen in love with. He's got a new house and a big barn to store his books, and all that has been brought about by being in touch with his instinct. So this is an example of how the lion can help as well as be a danger. And I thought I'd just show you this lovely picture of a lioness giving a man a hug. Isn't that gorgeous? So most of us are way out of touch with our instincts, so we need to cultivate a relationship with them, to cultivate a strong and loving bond with this deepest dimension of our nature. And if we do that, it won't necessarily take us over and act as our enemy. But all of you maybe have a particular animal you may have dreamt about. It may have been a lion, maybe a bear, maybe a hippopotamus, maybe a dinosaur. I've had lots of dinosaur dreams. Or maybe a little tiny animal like a cat or a dog or a horse. So pay attention to the animal in your dreams. It's very important what's happening to that animal. Is it wounded? Is it calling out in pain? Or is it acting as your guide and your help? So here I've come to a definition of evil, as best I can do, because I think that evil has its origins in the deeply unconscious predator-prey pattern of behavior that is active still in our primordial soul. And it may be defined as the intention to inflict, or the act of inflicting, terror, suffering, humiliation, torture, or death on another human being or another group of individuals. The more the conscious and unconscious aspects of our psyche are dissociated and in conflict with each other, the more likely we are to be possessed by the dark aspect of our primordial soul, which is symbolized in mythology by the dragon. If you remember, in Greek myth, there's always a dragon that's ravaging the land, and the princess has to be offered to it as a sort of sop to stop it doing that. And then along comes the hero and rescues the princess, and then he marries her, and he becomes the ruler of the kingdom. So this is overcoming these hugely powerful instincts. Greek myth knew all about how powerful they were. So, This dark aspect in Jungian terminology is the terrible mother who can swallow us up and cause us to regress into unconsciousness and barbarism, something that we can now see happening in the Middle East, as well as in Africa. When aroused by fear, trauma, childhood trauma, political ambition or religious zeal, these primordial instincts can burst through the fragile defenses of the conscious mind, take possession of it and cause it to act as predator, attacking whoever it designates as its prey. The enemy is out there. A psyche possessed by these instincts loses all sense of morality and the evolutionary achievement of a conscious, reflecting mind. Because of their immense age and power, they can easily overwhelm the still fragile conscious ego. And it's no good killing the dragon. We have to use the sword of insight to become conscious of where our instincts drive and possess us, if we are to have a hope of surviving as a species. This is a huge, huge cultural task of becoming aware of these instincts. So here we have a diagram of the psyche possessed by these primordial instincts, the dark aspect, as it were. And this is what happened in the 20th century, as I'll show you in a minute. So there's no barrier between the personal part of the unconscious and the deeper collective. And what happens is the deeper patterns rise up and take possession of the conscious ego, which is the little red triangle at the top. And the conscious ego doesn't know what's happened. It just says, I've got to kill that enemy, I've got to get out there, I've got to rape those women, I've got to take possession, I've got to build up my empire. It no longer says, what am I doing? Is this right? It says, I have to do it. I must do it. God says I must do it. So when these elements of the unconscious psyche are allied to a hugely inflated ego with no boundaries and no moral capacity to distinguish between right and wrong, we have a psychopath who may lose all sense of morality and the evolutionary achievement of a conscious self. And the people who blindly follow him, thinking that they're also going to be part of this strong man leading them, are thrown back thousands of years, becoming an unconscious unit of the tribe again, something that the whole thing of individuality really rescued us from, serving a depraved concept of deity or a depraved ideology which is calling for bloodshed and power. When thousands, even millions, follow a psychopathic leader or are terrified into submission, as I think Germany was under Nazism, we have a collective psychosis and millions die because of it. So, having survived the mass psychosis of 3 totalitarian regimes in the last century, which between them killed between 100 and 200 million people, there was also Pol Pot in Cambodia, which I haven't included. We are now faced with a 4th, a new and powerful ideology which promotes the aim of a Sunni Islamist caliphate taking root in the Middle East and extending itself in a great arc from Iraq right along the shore of North Africa as far as Tunisia, hopefully including large parts of Africa within it. So this is a psychosis again that we're faced with. Its ultimate aim is absolute power to establish a worldwide Islamic theocracy, governed by beliefs and laws that prevailed in the 7th century and have undergone little change since that time. Despite the teaching of all religions about the sanctity of life, we can see that humanity as a whole is still morally unconscious, still easily drawn to follow ideologies that are promoted by psychopathic leaders, and to accept their call to kill whoever they designate as their enemies, and to take pride in killing other people. That is what a psychosis is. Jung commented on these psychoses. Although man believes that he can change himself without limit, the astounding and rather terrifying fact remains that despite civilization and the influence of religions, he is still morally as much in bondage to his instincts as an animal, and can therefore fall victim at any moment to the beast within. So I hope I've clarified this whole situation of how the unconscious can take over the conscious mind. So now I'm coming on to the nuclear weapons that Scylla was talking about this morning. He said that with the splitting, Einstein said, with the splitting of the atom, everything has changed, save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophes. Einstein tried to stop the development of the atom bomb before he died, but he wasn't able to. And so did somebody called Dr. Joseph Rotblat, who was the hero of both Scylla and myself. Very few people consider the possibility that with the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, we are encountering a pathology. We have fallen victim to the beast within. With nuclear fission, tremendous power was given into our hands, power that we were in no sense morally equipped to handle. The long-established belief that matter is dead rather than alive with spirit allowed us to split the atom and develop a dangerous technology which is leaving lethal residues of radioactivity on the Earth from some 2,000 nuclear explosions, as well as from the plutonium waste from 450 nuclear reactors, some elements of which can last for 500 million years. It has driven us to create ever more demonic weapons with which to perpetuate our addiction to war. It has given terrifying power to psychopathic leaders, such as those of Islamic State. It has created a very negative karma, as the Dalai Lama said about the war in Iraq. The fear of an enemy keeps us from seeing the enormity of the evil carried in our willingness to use these weapons and sacrifice millions of lives in order to defend ourselves. As former presidential candidate Denis Kucinich said, the idea that by having nuclear weapons you make the world a safer place is essentially insane. It is insane, but we can't see it because we think our own defense is paramount. So here I've drawn a map, or rather I've taken a map from Google to show the sites from 2009, this is, the estimated location of nuclear weapons in the 9 nations which have developed them. The red dots signified the placement of weapons that are operationally deployed, that is, ready to be fired on the instant. The blue dots are the locations where weapons are stored. So there are an awful lot of red dots. There's a great deal of information on my website, by the way, about nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. Now, I've taken this from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, what I'm going to read to you next. What would happen if an 800 kiloton nuclear warhead detonated above Midtown Manhattan or any other large city such as London? Here is part of a description that was posted in February this year by these atomic scientists. The warhead would probably be detonated slightly more than a mile above the city to maximize the damage created by its blast wave. Within a few tenths of millionths of a second after detonation, the center of the warhead would reach a temperature of roughly 200 million degrees Fahrenheit, about 100 million degrees Celsius, or 4 to 5 times the temperature at the center of the sun. A ball of superheated air would form, initially expanding outward at millions of miles per hour. It would act like a fast-moving piston on the surrounding air, compressing it at the edge of the fireball and creating a shock wave of vast size and power. After 1 second, the fireball would be roughly a mile in diameter and roughly 4,000 degrees hotter than the surface of the sun. It would almost instantly ignite fires over a total area of about 100 square miles. That's after 1 second. Within tens of minutes, everything within approximately 5 to 7 miles would be engulfed in a gigantic firestorm. The fire would extinguish all life and destroy almost everything else. Tens of miles downwind the area of immediate destruction, radioactive fallout would begin to arrive within a few hours of the detonation. So this is the weapon that we, the human species, have created. In my view, the presence of these weapons and their possible use pollutes not only the planet, but the human psyche, and that is the collective human psyche. I recently reread a lecture called The Problem of Peace, given by Dr. Albert Schweitzer in November 1954, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. And in it he addressed the problem of our moral immaturity in relation to the Superman power of our technology and our weapons, of which we're so proud. This is what he said: "The Superman suffers from a fatal flaw. He has failed to rise to the level of superhuman reason to match that of his superhuman strength. Because he lacks it, the conquests of science and technology become a mortal danger to him rather than a blessing. The essential fact we should have acknowledged a long time ago is that we are becoming inhuman to the extent that we become supermen. We have learned to tolerate the facts of war, to tolerate that men are killed en masse, that whole cities and their inhabitants are annihilated by the atomic bomb, that men are turned into living torches by incendiary bombs. In resigning ourselves to our fate without a struggle, we are guilty of inhumanity. It is my profound conviction that the solution lies in our rejecting war for an ethical reason, namely that war makes us guilty of the crime of inhumanity." Now that speech can be read on Google, on the internet, and I would advise all of you to read it. It's very moving. So in the light of this speech, what do we feel when we hear that there are approximately 17,000 nuclear weapons held by the 9 nuclear nations, and that the US and Russia between them have a total of 15,000 nuclear weapons? In the US, there are 450 Minuteman III missiles kept ready to launch from underground silos within minutes of receiving a presidential order. We in England have a Trident submarine constantly patrolling the oceans that is armed with 40 warheads that between them have the power to incinerate over 76 million human beings if they were all fired at once. Do we recognize the pathology of these facts and their danger to the world because of human error or malicious intent? Now, just in the last couple of days, it was reported that a young man, a young seaman on the submarine called the Victorious, has blown the whistle, first of all, on the appalling state of that particular submarine, that it's not in good shape at all, and secondly, on the fact that the security around it is ridiculous. He said this nightclub security would be better than there is on the submarine. He's put 18 pages of his indictment of what's being done onto the internet, and he's now being searched for by obviously the police and the government and everybody trying to catch him, put him in prison for life, because that would be his fate. But this is the courage, the same courage that a Russian man had in speaking out against that situation in Russia when they were about to fire the nuclear weapon, what they thought was a response to a weapon coming their way. So he says that any terrorist or psychopath could get into that submarine and fire it into England or anywhere else that he chose to. So that's the situation. We're threatened with our own stupidity, with annihilation. Turning to another subject altogether, 2 of the greatest teachers of humanity taught us, each one of them in their own way, how to raise our primordial instincts to the awakened state, symbolized here by the great serpent, whose 7 hoods protect the Buddha who is seated on its coils, and by the figure of Christ rising from the tomb above the sleeping soldiers. They did not ask for belief and worship. And that's the huge mistake we made, to think that they did. They asked for the transformation of human consciousness, still unconsciously in bondage to primordial instincts, into the awakened and enlightened state that they themselves embody. So in alchemy, which I'll be speaking about on Thursday, we have this image of killing the king, killing the old dissociated solar consciousness that is holding the world hostage. This new century asks us to take on the mammoth task of recognizing and discarding the habits of behavior which have been justified for millennia as necessary and right from the perspective of achieving national or territorial or religious supremacy. We urgently need to move from a national to a planetary perspective, and this can only be done by an increase in the number of individuals who hold this perspective, increasing the field, like Stella was saying. If we can increase this great network of individuals all over the planet, there's some hope. We have the innate intelligence and capacity to change, but very little time in which to accomplish this immense transformation of consciousness. So here we have the dragon standing behind the hero, with that huge power helping the hero to achieve this aim which we all hold in our hearts. So to reconnect with the part of our soul that has been split off and dissociated from the conscious ego, we need to become aware of these instincts that are deeply unconscious. We need to learn how to recognize them, relate to them, and free ourselves and them from their immense power, because you're actually freeing the instinct from the compulsion to repeat the old pattern. Because while we're doing that, we're connecting with the power of the dragon in the confrontation with injustice and cruelty and suffering of every kind. This requires insight, and it requires awareness of one's own psychic wounds so one isn't driven by them, and constant vigilance. And it's a truly heroic task. The warrior ethos can be taken to a new level in the battle to release humanity from the bondage of unconsciousness. So today, to end, we're living at a time of momentous evolutionary change, which demands the breakdown of outworn beliefs and long-established habits and the birth of a new worldview. The scientific discoveries of the last 100 years have shattered the foundation upon which our culture was built, just as the discoveries of Copernicus shattered the medieval view of reality. Yet we do not have a philosophy, a cosmology, or a morality that is commensurate with the staggering discoveries we have made. So our deepest need is to connect with the evolutionary impulse that is asking us to become conscious of our role in relation to the planet. And this is what all of us in this room are feeling, that's something we need to contribute to helping the planet. We need to birth a new planetary consciousness within our culture. And to do this, we need to reconnect with our heart, with the instinctive sources of wisdom within our soul. If we can recover the values that were intrinsic to the ancient participatory way of knowing, without losing the priceless evolutionary attainment of a reflective mind, together with all the discoveries we have made and the skills we have developed, we could heal both the fissure in our soul and our raped and vandalized planet. So we need a new story, a new myth, and a new concept of spirit that includes nature and the sacred feminine, if we are to create a better kind of civilization and discover a higher destiny and a different goal. In my next talk, I will look at some aspects of this new story.